But I think the question was, can you have music? Can you have your Bible? What can you have? Well, I would suggest that you spend some time without any of that. But you don't lay down laws about things of that sort. You ask yourself, what is the purpose of solitude? Which I hope now you might have a little something to go on. And then you ask yourself, will this distract or hinder the purpose of solitude? And if it does, I would dispense with it. And a good way to find out whether or not you need it is start without it. But you don't want to be too harsh on yourself. Don't be a hero. That's a general rule about disciplines, is do not be heroic. So I think actually that as you enter into solitude, it's going to be so rich that you will not need something to jangle you or to help you worship. So just be experimental about it. That's the main thing. You'll find out what you need to do as you go along. When you go into a discipline, your teacher is Jesus, and he will teach you. Way back there.
You had a comment earlier about letting your staff know what you're doing.
Yes.
And to make provision for them. I'd just like to put in a word as a spouse of a pastor of 33 years that you also allow your spouse to do that. I had earlier told my husband, I needed that, but you watch the kids like I do, and he's gone. So that's just my word.
No, that's absolutely right. All the people around you, but most importantly, your spouse, if you have one, make sure not only that you let them know what's going on, but you try to help them understand it, and you make provision for them. And there are few people that need solitude more than young mothers. And so if you're in a fellowship where you have understanding, you can make provision for that. And you want to be thoughtful in every connection that you have with other people. Yes?
At what age do you think you could start introducing your kids to this kind of
For the discipline, spiritual disciplines, very young.
Or specifically even solitude, or I mean.
Well, you don't need to give them a big word or a theory, but you need your children to have times to play alone, and don't give them a bunch of stuff to occupy them. Let them learn how to be with themselves, and I think that's one of the most helpful things you can do for a child, is to not make a big deal out of it, but just make arrangements. They generally, when they're quite young, love to play alone. And until they're ruined, they enjoy that. And actually sometimes you have people who will try to get them out of that. But they need to be able to play alone, and they need to be able to play imaginatively. And there was a time not long ago when children, and in some parts of the world I hope still have that, just leave them alone. They'll find a corner of the yard, and pretty soon their imagination will have that all the way up with Jack and the Beanstalk. They will build, and and their imagination will grow, and they will know who they are. If you don't do that, they will be kids that come around and look at you reproachfully and say, "I'm bored." And then you've got a real problem. You've got a real problem. And it takes a lot of wisdom to communicate to them that they're approaching things wrongly if they're bored. And then that will grow up, and then They will not like themselves, and they will have to get stuff to fix their minds. Yes and yes.
The life of the imagination as a child, we applaud it. As adults, we think we should outgrow imagination.
God help us.
God help us. Can you speak of how the gift of the imagination is a tool for spiritual disciplines, for spiritual life?
Well, because of imagination is what it is, you can't very well do much but try to get out of its way and let it roll on. Children's literature is especially helpful if it's the right sort of thing. But we need to encourage it, and we need to bring it to the Bible, and we need to let children be very creative with it as much as they can. And I don't know really much more to say than that. I'm sorry?
You mentioned earlier in the conversation that you use imagination in prayer.
Well, I use imagination in the sense that I imagine things, I image things, yes. And particularly if you're praying for something, you need to have a pretty firm grasp of what it is. And usually the imagination is used to refer to something that is not real. And that's unfortunate, because imagination is a primary instrument that we use to come to grips with what is real. And so I don't use imagination as a kind of trick or magical thing. And it's important to stay out of magic in prayer. But you do need to be able to very clearly image what you're praying about. Vague prayers rarely do anything, rarely accomplish anything. That's because prayer is not a way of manipulating something, it is a way of working at something. It is a way of working at something with God. And in that process, you need to be able to graphically bring before you what it is you are doing, so that you don't just vapor off into bless them, Lord. Yes.
Comment on that. It's so easy for Satan to step in and ruin prayer. When I was younger, we lost our dog, and my aunt said, "You just have to have faith and pray, and it'll come back." And so, every day I'd go out and put the food out and the water out, knowing that my dog was going to come back, because I had faith that my dog was going to come back. And she never did. And just how all of a sudden God must not be good because he didn't, or I must not be good because God didn't answer my prayer.
Yep, you have just written a volume on it. Yep, that's very true. God does not answer our prayers because we have faith. I'll leave you to think about that for a while. I want to say a little bit about prayer later on, but I'm really getting up against it now on time. And I do want to say something about the other disciplines, and we'll come back on and touch briefly on prayer, because prayer is a major discipline, in addition to being much else. Silence. There are two kinds of silence: quietness and not talking. There actually are different disciplines. Though obviously they're related, because if you're talking, you're not in quietness. So there is a choice to have no sound. It's a matter of degree, unless you go into a cork-lined recording studio or something of that sort. But just once in a while it might be good to make a stop off in such a place to learn what quietness is, because we lose track of it, and accordingly lose track of its effects upon our souls. Total silence is very rare and not something that one should seek for long periods of time. And what we usually call silence or being quiet is just a matter of degree. And we forget what it is. Our households and offices are filled with whirring, buzzing, murmuring, grinding, chattering, whining contraptions. So it's almost impossible to have quiet now in a house. Try it in this place, right? In the middle of the night. And there's all kinds of noises going, and now we need to try that out some, because silence allows you to hear the hidden landscape. It allows you to discover that the wind of eternity is blowing in your face. And so it's important to experiment with that. And one aspect of that is we can turn off the rackets, the CD, the radio, the tape player, the iPod, and so forth. We can experience what it is like not to be at the disposal of noise. And so, again, say, well, why? Well, you'll find out when you do it. But sound goes deeply into the soul. It's even said that it is the last of the senses that you lose when you're dying. You have a different presence to yourself when you are in silence. Sound tugs at you. So that's one kind of silence, and the other kind of silence is not talking. And not talking is a whole theme, a whole story in itself. And one of the main things that we let go when we enter into silence is adjusting how others perceive us. And we learn to let them make up their own minds. We don't try to man the facades that we do when we talk. James really goes deeply into this issue in his letter. And the Proverbs are full of statements about this. The power of the tongue, for good as well as for evil. And how to stop that? Well, we first start by stopping talking, and then we find that we can talk much more to the point. And as Paul says, we can let our words be bearers of grace. But it's rare to be able to do that if we have not practiced silence, so that we speak out of silence. And not just as a part of the yammering that goes on around us. James says, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. It's an interesting connection. What has wrath got to do with speaking? Well, if you have observed very much, you will see that wrath usually depends upon speaking. When it gets going between people, it's nearly always a result of or sustained by language. When the tongue is moving rapidly, wrath is usually found close at hand. And James also says, as the proverb does, in the multitudes of words there is sin. Sin has a particular association with the tongue. Think of how it works in exchanges around sexuality, as well as anger and wrath, pride, vanity, and so on. And learning not to speak gives us a kind of grasp upon many of these other things that depend upon speaking and how we speak. There's a major problem in trying to witness to people and evangelize. It's often too much talking and too little listening. One of the ways that you can communicate most effectively to people is listening to them. And in order to do that, you need to be able to not talk. We often encourage people to evangelize by talking. And sometimes, unfortunately, because as Unamuno, the Spanish philosopher, says, we need to pay less attention to what people are trying to tell us and more to what they tell us without trying. And actually, that's most of what we witness to, is what we tell people without trying. So we need to think about stopping and then learning how to speak out of silence. Very often, talking a lot is just a manifestation of lack of confidence, fear, uncertainty. And when we turn to silence, we begin to learn a different way of experiencing ourselves and God, and that allows us to see the world different and relate to it differently. On page 165, The Spirit of the Disciplines, I quote the testimony of a young person, actually a Japanese girl in Japan, who happened to be taking some training with a Christian minister on this. And I've always thought she just hit it so solidly. She said, the more I practice this discipline of solitude and silence, the more I appreciate the strength of silence. And the less I become skeptical and judgmental, the more I learn to accept the things I don't like about others, the more I accept them as uniquely created in the image of God, the less I talk, the fuller are words spoken at an appropriate time. And the more I value others, the more I serve them in small ways, the more I enjoy and celebrate my life. The more I celebrate, the more I realize God has been giving me wonderful things in my life. And the less I worry about my future. I will accept and enjoy what God is continuously giving to me. I think I am beginning to really enjoy God. Now, you can tell people about solitude and silence until you're blue in the face, but it's the experience of it that brings this to you. And it is primarily, I think, because when we are silent, we lay aside our efforts in various directions to control others. Now, of course, silence itself, nothing sacred about it. Talking, nothing evil about it. And that's, with reference to disciplines, you have to get used to that. What you're abstaining from, usually there's nothing wrong with it. But it is harming your life and the lives of those around you. And so it isn't like you just quit, like you take a vow of silence and you're not going to speak anymore. Don't be silly. There's a time to speak as well as a time to be silent. And we learn by experience the effects of silence and solitude on our souls, our spirits, our body. And it has wonderful consequences then for particular issues about doing the things that Jesus said. Well, just a word about frugality. Frugality is a matter of abstaining from using money or goods that are at our disposal in ways that merely gratify our desires for status, glamour, or luxury. Practicing frugality means we stay within the bounds of what generally would fall in good judgment and designate as necessary for the kind of life which God has led us. So there's a judgment about what is necessary and what is not. And this discipline is something that people have recognized, even pagan cultures have recognized the danger of lavishness and luxury, and various governments at times have passed what are known as sumptuary laws forbidding exhibitions of luxury beyond what is necessary. And the reason for that is because it really does hurt people. Luxury establishes a relationship between the rich and the poor and involves people in expenditures that are not for good in the way that they could be. Frivolous consumption corrupts the soul away from trust in, worship of, and service to God. Frugality is a service to God and humankind, for in being frugal, we are able to use our money in ways that would benefit the work of God and others. But we are concerned about it as a discipline here. This is one of those practices that has many benefits other than the disciplinary benefit. And the benefit of the discipline is to train us away from dependence on a sensual kind of existence. Sensuality, living for feelings, is harmful to the soul. In our society, a primary manifestation of the harm that comes from not having frugality is the bondage that is caused by financial debt. And there are many factors involved, but our current financial distress that we're in is due to a failure of frugality. And if you follow the money trail and you discover at a certain point that there wasn't money, there was promises. Those promises were used by and large to buy things for which there was no good reason. And just look at Mr. Madoff again and see what he spent his money on. And then the money that was not money but was promises began to disappear, and we found that we're caught up as a society in a huge Ponzi scheme. Promises, promises, promises. And you try to keep that pyramid of promises going, and eventually it collapses. And then we decided that the way out of debt was more debt. And the fundamental reality is people who could not say no. And they could not say no because they were hooked on a sensual mode of living. Now, that's not the whole story, and many people are hurting not because they're hooked on a sensual mode, but because this thing collapses and the goods are not there that they need. So pursuing luxury leads one to be incapable of dealing with necessities. And that's basically where we are now. And I don't want to take time to go into that further. You probably understand it all. But debt is a terrible problem, because debt allows you to possess something that you haven't paid for. And you have enough of that going, and especially if you possess things that aren't necessary, that are frivolous, then you build a society and a personality that is built on a lack of reality. That's why Paul says, let no debt remain outstanding except the continuing debt to love one another. I love this quote that I give on 169 and 70 from John Joseph Surin. He was once asked why, when so many people seem to wish to be great in God's eyes, there are so few who are truly saintly. And the chief reason, he replied, is that they give too big a place in life to indifferent things. And that is precisely what you do when you move away from frugality. There are a lot of things that you need to say here. One is that frugality isn't the same as stinginess and cheapness. And much harm is done by a teaching, especially to young people and children, where things that aren't necessarily necessary, but they want them, and they are rejected on a basis of stinginess and cheapness. And God is not cheap. He not only owns the cattle on 1,000 hills, he owns the Cadillacs on 1,000 hills. He owns the whole thing. God does not need our money, but we need to be careful with it, because money is a form of our kingdom, and when we expend it in foolish ways, it will make us pay a price for that. Another thing that needs to be said, frugality is not poverty. Poverty is neither a discipline nor a virtue. Jesus was not poor. And if you think he was poor, do go back and read your New Testament and try to figure out what was going on there. He's often presented as if he slept under the bridge and ate out of a garbage can. But he was well off enough to have an embezzler as his secretary treasurer. They don't hang around where there's no money. Right? He raised funds, he supported his ministry, he gave to the poor. Jesus was not poor. And it's no virtue to be poor and no advantage to be poor. It can have some disciplinary effects, and it can keep bad people from doing worse. So, but just don't confuse poverty with frugality. Poverty is not a discipline. And what is called poverty by most people today, and where vows of poverty are taken, is not poverty. People confuse poverty with ownership. Poverty is not a matter of ownership, it's a matter of use. Doesn't matter who owns it if you have the use of it. But it's one of those curiously deceptive things that religious people have developed to say, well, I am poor, I don't own anything. Well, what is accessible to you? Now, forgive me if I offend you, but this is something we really need to think about. Some very wonderful people, like Mother Teresa, lived under a vow of poverty. But when she was down in Tijuana and she had some heart trouble, they swiftly brought her to the best possible medical clinic on the face of the earth. A mother in South Los Angeles, or perhaps in an area of Denver, who is really poor and has to take her children by bus to a cheap hospital, changing 3 times and spending half the day getting there, that's poor. That's poor. So I just want to take a minute just to jar your thinking, if that's what it is, and help you understand frugality is one thing, poverty is another. You could undertake poverty as a service. If God called you to do that, you should do that. That would be a good thing. You could undertake poverty as a discipline, though when you start to work the details out, it's a little hard. And most people who experience poverty do not experience it as a discipline or a virtue, the real thing. So do think about that. Yes, sir.
So when scriptures talk about foxes having a nest, and birds having a nest, and the Son of Man has no place to lay his head, is that a reference to a choice or a homelessness or?
No, that was a reference to how Jesus was living. But now think a moment, you see, that doesn't say Jesus was poor. Rabbis routinely did that. They traveled about the country. They didn't have a steady place to live. For part of his life or part of his ministry, apparently Jesus did have that, but he didn't always. And so he's saying to the man, now, if you're going to be my disciple, you have to understand this is a particular mode of life, and you have to be ready for it. But see, we have to rethink all of these passages because we've had the image hung on us of Jesus as a person who was poor. And perhaps partly because he said, "Blessed are the poor." But look at the details of his life. He was not poor. He had people supporting him, caring for him, giving him money. He gave money. You can't give it if you don't have it. And remember, when we glorify poverty, that nearly everything that we glorify is supported by people with money. So, just challenging you to rethink that. And of course, you have many scriptures on it, and I need to say a word about chastity. Chastity is not a good word for what I want to talk about here because it's more of an outcome than it is a discipline. This is on page 170 of the Spirit of the Disciplines, if you have the book there and you're trying to follow. What is the discipline of chastity? In chastity, we refrain for a lengthy period of time from sexual acts, thoughts, and desires as a way of accustoming oneself to freedom from domination by sex. Sex is not bad in itself any more than food or conversation. The biblical and Christian view of sexual desire is that, like all desires, it is good in its place. It is not elimination that we seek, but subordination to the good is what is needed. And one of the most important things in the life of training for the disciple is to be able not to be dominated by sexual desire. And we know how hard that proves to be for so many people today, because we live in an atmosphere of constant sexualization of everything. And as sex is now lived in our world, it is a major source of evil, and those in ministry and those they serve suffer from it. We are operating from broken souls with devastating results. So we have to say something about it. And training ourselves to simply move out of that realm in our thoughts, and if we are legitimately engaged with another person, in our actions for a time, frees us up from simply being dominated by sex. Love and joy in life generally is to be cultivated as a bulwark against domination by sexual experiences. One of the things that sex does in life is to supply a substitute for drama and intimacy. It creates illusions in that regard. And it has attached to it a pleasure of a certain kind that is very powerful. In sexuality, basically what we desire is not just physical engagement, but what we desire is the desire of the other for us. So being desirable becomes a major issue in sexuality. And that takes over in its male forms and in its female forms in different ways, of course. But wanting to be sexually attractive, nothing wrong in that in itself, but it goes crazy. And then because we can't achieve intimacy, we keep beating on that sexual button to try to get something out of it, and it doesn't come. Because intimacy with another person, which is what is really desired in sexual relationships, and not just the physical, because it's, of course, it's much bigger than that, and it gets reduced to the physical in the way it often does in its more bizarre manifestations, just because we're lonely and don't seem to have meaning in our lives, and we find meaning in romance and sex and its various modifications. So now what I'm saying is fairly simple, that we practice chastity by abstaining from sexual involvements of all kinds, including our thoughts and our feelings, and in so doing we are set free in our habits from domination by sexuality. Well, there's lots of stuff in the scripture, and again, in the spirit of the disciplines, I've given a lot of references to things, and I don't have time to deal with all of that. Homosexuality is simply a case in point where someone has decided to live in terms of a peculiar form of desire. And so they take on an identity. Now this is peculiarly true for today. It has not always been true that people who had homosexual desires and acted them out identified themselves as homosexuals. But if I come to your town, I hope you will not introduce me as a well-known heterosexual advocate. My heterosexuality does not define me as a person. And I don't think anyone should be defined in terms of their sexuality. A homosexual is someone who devotes themselves to the gratification of homosexual desire. That's not a place to be as a human being. I wouldn't want to be a person who had devoted themselves to the desire for strawberry milkshakes. It's degrading to find one's identity or to identify others in terms of a desire. Whether it's a good desire or a bad one. I mean, there's nothing really wrong with desiring strawberry milkshakes, but if you have your identity with reference to that, wouldn't you say you're in trouble? And so, I mean, I know there's a lot, you may want to discuss some more of that, but to be devoted to a desire of anything And to identify yourself in those terms is not good. It's not good to mistreat and disregard and not love homosexuals. You treat them in the way that Christ taught us to treat others. But that does not include saying that what they want and what they do is good. And the tension that we're in now, and it has gotten awfully quiet in the room, the tension we're in now is one where we are demanded to approve. It isn't like that you are not going to treat people with love. It's that you can't love them unless you approve of them. And so the old saying we used to use easily, hate the sin and love the sinner, you can't do that anymore. And this is partly due to the fact that the sense of self has disappeared from people, and they identify themselves in terms of what they do and not what they are. So if you condemn what I do, you couldn't possibly approve of me or love me. Now that is a stage of desire forcing itself forward onto people. Desire not just content to be my desire, but now I'm forcing it on you. And we now live in this country under a form of the tyranny of a minority that has learned how to manipulate the public resources, including law, to force their opinions upon others. Yes, sir.
Is there a way to help people see that they're not with their desires?
Well, I do believe there is. But for example, or to illustrate, if I'm going to engage with someone about a discussion about homosexuality, I don't want to start there. And I won't start there. I want to know what they think about God. I want to know what they believe is right and wrong, and whether or not there is a difference. And then at some point, if we can sustain the discussion, we can talk about what is helpful and what is not about homosexual desire, and then further on homosexual practice, and then further on the acceptance of homosexuality as an acceptable and good style of life. My experience is if you try to start there, you might as well forget it. So that's why, after all, the most basic thing about them is not what they think about sex, it's what they think about God. And if you start with what they think about sex, you're going to wind up with a God who thinks what they do. So this is a very difficult thing, and I only take it up because I know you have to deal with it yourself. You're constantly faced with it in life. Issues about ministry come up. And so I just want to say that the problem we're in with sexuality today is not just about sexuality. It is primarily about other things, the meaning of life. Why are we here? What is good and evil? In particular, what is the Christian message and reality? And if you don't get that right, it's no wonder that we wind up with huge denominations having to spend unlimited amounts of money and time trying to figure out what to do about a particular issue with homosexuals. We shouldn't be there. How did we get there? And that's where you need to be thinking and doing the work. Individual homosexuals you love just like you would love anyone, and that means you seek to do what is best for them. It does not mean that you seek to do what they want you to do. So now we have to go back to our earlier discussions. What is love? And love is not doing what someone wants you to do. Love is doing what is best for people. And if we have worked through those kinds of considerations, then we are able to go on to other troubling issues. The practice of chastity purifies our thoughts and allows us to step free from playing the various games around which sex and romance, the look, verbal and bodily innuendo, subtones, trying for perfect satisfaction in our marriage. We must regard others as spiritual beings in a world that is spiritual. Sex is a passing mode of human union for specific purposes. You are a whole person before God regardless of sex and marriage. If you never are married, if you never have sex. Now we have these silly things that show up like our movies, the 40-year-old virgin. Ha, 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 ha. Right? Like a 40-year-old virgin is a freak. Some kind of freak. Ought to have him in a sideshow in the circus. It's just tragic when it gets there. You are a whole person. And you still have to make decisions of various kinds, but you don't want to lose that. Your identity is not sexuality. It is not being married or not being married or any of that. Comments and questions? I must have gotten off the reservation.
Chastity almost seems different. Seems like it's a different sort of thing than the other disciplines, isn't it?
The word doesn't fit, and I've tried to think of a word. This, as I say, chastity is actually an outcome. And the discipline is what you do to get there. But there just isn't any word that will do it. So I try to spell it out there.
And there's really not a time that we should not practice chastity. Is that correct?
Okay, now this is the hard part. Yeah. Yes, there are times when we should not. The way I've described it is abstaining from act, thought, involvement sexually. Now, if we are married, there are times when we should engage in sexual acts, thoughts, and feelings. Right. And so the problem is let's put it this way. There is no time when we should not be chaste, which is not the same thing as celibate. Okay. So this is where, we have plenty good teachings on this in the New Testament, the Old Testament about it, and then also about how it goes wrong. So the chastity as a discipline is the exercise of a certain abstinence for a definite period of time. And as a discipline, we should not be always engaged in it. Now, this is a good time to dig a little deeper here, I guess. Are sexual thoughts wrong? Okay? Are sexual thoughts dirty? Is being sexually tempted dirty? Well, before you answer, let's put this up. It's actually a kind of general teaching that we need to help us deal with many, many different issues. But there is constant confusion among Christians about these, and we need to distinguish them. One is the thought of sin. Did Jesus ever have a thought of sin? Well, I hope he did. He talked about it a lot. I would hope that he had some thoughts about it. And in the domain of sex, perhaps you would have a flash of a thought about a wrong sexual relationship. Thought. No inclination. Now, inclination is the next move. That's where you have some tendency towards doing it. That's going to be a matter of degree. If you have a thought of getting drunk, that's different from having a temptation to get drunk. Some people have thoughts of it and no inclination at all, or if anything, an inclination in the opposite direction. Temptation is thought and inclination, but no relenting of the will. And this is why I like to talk about William James before we come to this part, because of his very lovely presentation of what it means when you consent, the consent of the will. You can have temptation without consent. You can have temptation without even consenting to the temptation. But on the other hand, if you don't want to consent, there are some things you should probably do so you wouldn't. And then there is sin. There is the relenting of the will. A yes to the deed, whether actually carried out or not. Now, when you read Matthew 5, where Jesus is talking about you have already committed adultery in your heart, that's here. That's not here. He is talking about temptation enthusiastically entered into. That's what he's talking about. He's talking about cultivating it, fostering it, and in particular about using another person for that purpose. So now the ordinary person is going to have sexual thoughts. If they aren't careful, those thoughts can become obsessive. And now I hope you go back to the William James stuff and you can utilize it in thinking about this. The discipline of chastity is to turn away from such thoughts. Not necessarily because they are bad. They aren't in themselves. There's nothing wrong with sexual thoughts. Temptation, well, it depends. If you like it, you've got a problem. And there's a lot of that in our culture. See, that's titillation is practically a division of the economy in the United States. Don't go there. Did you sin if you went there? Maybe not. But you don't need to be that close to it. Unless you've got a problem. Then you need to deal with the problem. What might the problem be? You might be bored stiff. You might be stuck in a job that just, I can't stand it. In other words, your life might be so devoid of drama and meaning that you're ready for anything that will give you a buzz. Beyond coffee. Actually, it doesn't give me a buzz. If it did, I'd quit. So now then, why is this so important? It's so important to help people so that they don't think they have sinned when they haven't. And it's important to help them to know when sin is coming around the mountain. See, that's, you know the song, she'll be coming around the mountain when she comes. Sin is always like that. And a major part of learning how to live beyond it is recognizing it when she's coming around the mountain. And you get off the conveyor belt in time. Don't get on it if you can, not get on it, but if you find yourself on the conveyor belt, get off. Don't just lie there and say, I can't not do it. No, you can. Same thing with positive things in a different direction. Yes, you were going to say something. Okay, all right, yes, sir. Oh, sorry.
I just had a question. I think you said that a sexual thought is not a sin if it's still in the number 1 stage.
That
So
is-
if you are married
yeah.
and you have a thought of having sex with whoever else, that's not a sin.
That's not a
when you
sin.
don't-
Not a sin. Now, if you start to enjoy it and cultivate it, that's still not a sin, but you're getting warm. Right. And you want to recognize that. But if you start beating yourself up for having sinned at that point, the next thing you have to say is, well, I've already sinned, so we might as well go ahead and do it. I'm giving you real scripts out of a pastor's life where you have to listen to people.
Yes.
And they say that. And actually they use that as an excuse for going ahead and doing what they want. Thank you for helping us clarify that, okay? Yes.
So going back to William James's, excessive thoughts could eventually change the inclination of the will.
You bet it can. You bet it can, and that's the whole point of what we've been doing today, is to get that there. So now, that's why if you're dealing with this, you want to pay attention to this. But you want to realize that in itself, it is not sin. And realize that you can turn it in that direction. Now then, at this level, this would be the level at which you probably have more than one idea. You may be thinking about the wrong thing, but you also have some other things, other ideas in your mind. And the key is to turn to those other ideas. And you have that ability, but if you don't understand this, you may not know that. And you may just think it's all one thing and be unable to deal with it. Now, what does chastity as the practice I've described do? It helps you come to terms with this. To begin with, it helps you know it's okay if you're not even here. And you live in a culture that would tell you, well, if you're not even here, you're sick. You're sick. Yes, sir.
I guess from Dr. Baker's question, what would be the healthy sexual expression of a single person then, or the time to not be under the
Well, the general response to that is be leading a kind of life that is full enough of good things and strengthening things that when the thought came by, it didn't suck you up like a vacuum cleaner.
I guess I'm just trying to understand the difference between the abstinence and chastity as a single person and not the abstinence of chastity as a single person.
A single person can use the discipline of chastity, as I've described it here, in order to live in a state of chasteness, cleanness. They have to know that. And they have to get it straight, that there's nothing unhealthy about that. And that they will be stronger if they have times where by choice they choose not to engage in sexual thoughts, feelings, kinds of relationships that are marginal. You can choose not to do that. And if you do choose not to do it, you'll be in a much stronger position. If you don't, these are apt to develop in ways that you will regret. Yes.
So just to clarify, I was thinking that you were saying sin is when you start to cultivate the thought, but you said that's not true. So is sin when you actually
Sin is when you consent to it.
to do it?
When you would do it
Okay.
if it were possible. So the question is not just, I did not have sex with that woman, as someone once said. Would you, if you could have? If you would, if you could, the consent is already given. Now, I know that this is really ticklish, and there's a whole lot of stuff. I mean, you go back through the ages of the churches, you find them dealing with this. And one of the things that we lost when we threw out the Catholic side was a lot of extremely fine work on how to deal with these kinds of issues. Of course, there's a lot of failures as well, and that's par for the course. But we have to talk about it because it is such an issue for us. And many, many dimensions, not just things like pornography and adultery and so on, but the misery around sexuality. Both for people who are single and sometimes devout Christians who are single, they're still miserable about this issue. And partly on the basis of mistaken interpretations of their humanity and feeling that somehow they're less than human, less than prosperous and all of that. So it just has a lot of dimensions. And we need to affirm our identity in distinction from our sexuality. Now, that itself is like rank heresy in many quarters. Do you mean my maleness isn't a part of my identity? Your femaleness? Actually, yes, that's right. Now then, being a man or a woman does enter substantially into our life, but it's not our identity. Now, it used to be said that a man's way to a man's heart was through his stomach. Did you know that? But Mama has moved out of the kitchen into the bedroom now. That's exactly what we're taught. So if you're not engaged sexually, what are you? Nothing. Or if you are married, why do you matter to the other person? It's just sex. Thank you very much. Now, think about marriage in terms other than sexuality. Is there anything there? Well, there'd better be, because if you live long enough, apparently there ain't going to be any in heaven, but often it stops before heaven.
That's when they created the little purple pill.
You're thinking they might have that in heaven. You have really contributed to our discussion. Thank you so much. Because one of the things that comes from the practice of chastity in marriage is the deepening of the personal relationship between the persons who are married, and to receive one another and bless one another. Just because you are the one that has given yourself to me and I to you in wedding, marriage, living together under God. See, that's what we're really trying to get at. And actually, the kind of intimacy that you have spoken of is what people are really after through sex. And it won't come. And so then they keep hitting that button, and then all sorts of problems come, like, well, I'll get someone else, or two of them, and so on. Yes, ma'am.
I heard a story told one time about a Bible study that was being conducted, and it was a marriage kind of thing, and women were told that if your husband has had a hard day, you know, a way to comfort him was to give him sex.
Right.
And I think, you know, we don't give men enough credit. I mean, for heaven's sake, they're not just
Well,
sexual organ.
that's
You know,
true.
There are to them than that, and that is really offensive to
It is offensive. But you see, that's essentially the same sort of degradation that comes from a person who identifies themselves as homosexual. You see, the basic problem with that is it does not do justice to the human dignity. It does not do justice to human dignity. And of course, I understand that some people would disagree with that, but it's exactly in the same area. It's a terrible thing for men and women to treat one another that way. I mean, there are other things that are bad too in that respect, but what it does is it cuts off genuine intimacy. Yes, right, and then you, and then you.
For many years, I thought I was in sin when I probably was in temptation.
Yep, or maybe even thought.
Yeah, and it just got really tiresome.
Mm-hmm.
I agreed there were certain things I wouldn't do.
Yes.
Wouldn't look at certain magazines,
Right.
go to certain kinds of movies
Mhm.
and things like that. But I had the idea that it would always be a constant and relentless struggle no matter what. And this is as good as it gets.
Well, actually, a failure even, because you're dealing with things like thoughts. And if you think that's sin,
Yeah.
it isn't just going to be a struggle, it's going to be a constant failure. And that's what many people live with. And especially you find young people brought up in that. And we just really need teaching. That's one reason why I go through this, is because I want people to have these distinctions, to think about them, and they are extremely liberating. Not just because you find out you didn't sin, but because now you know something you can do about it.
But I wanted to go on because I had an experience of inner healing. And one of the totally unanticipated consequences of that experience was that for a whole year, whenever I looked at a woman, women became 2 or 3 times more beautiful than I'd ever noticed.
Right.
There was not a hint of lust.
Yes.
And I don't know that I've ever heard anybody else say they had an experience like that. And now I have to be somewhat intentional again, but do you have a comment about that?
Yes. It's very important to distinguish the recognition of beauty from even the thought of sex, whether it's for a man or for a woman. And the recognition of beauty is distinct, and the failure to recognize that, though there are some problems with it, is that's where you find the popes going around and covering up Michelangelo's statues and pictures. And now, see, when people aren't really balanced and right in their souls, it may be they shouldn't see beauty because they can't confuse it like a man or a woman who confuses friendliness and openness from someone as a sexual overture. See, that's where our minds get twisted, so that a woman might realize that she can't actually be friendly with men because they'll think it's sexual overture. So the confusion that comes out of the darkness of the sinful mind blends these things over, and we can't deal with them. And you have to have that worked out in yourself in order to draw the distinctions in practice. But it's a very important distinction to draw. Yes, sir.
So, you're saying, and I agree, that we manipulate our sexuality when really we're searching for
Intimacy, love.
But how is intimacy experienced for a single person outside of the home?
Well, it should be with their families, with their friends, and you have to clear your mind as to what intimacy is, right?
What would you say intimacy is?
Intimacy is being present with another person in terms of who they are, where they're going, what they're doing. Sharing life is intimacy. Sharing life is the phrase for intimacy. And unfortunately, you can be sexually involved up to your ears and not sharing your life with anyone. The other side is, can you be sharing your life without being sexually involved? If you get your mind messed up enough, then when you see, for example, Jonathan and David and how intimate they were, you will say they're homosexuals, right? Because you can't interpret it any other way. Or the tenderness of a grandparent for a grandchild will turn into sexual activity. I mean, that's just a part of the terrible confusion that people fall into when they decline from their knowledge of God that would enable them to be intimate with other persons without sexual involvement. Yes. And then, I'm sorry, I got you.
Can I ask you to please clarify? Did you say that Matthew 5, when Jesus says that if you look on a woman lustfully, you have already committed adultery, you said that's in number 2? Is that what you said?
I said that is a case where temptation cultivated has already turned into number 3.
Okay.
But now you have to read that language carefully, okay, dear?
Yeah.
You don't put anything into it that's not really there.
Okay.
For example, some of your translations say, who looks at a woman and lusts after her. And. It isn't and. It's for the purpose of lusting after her.
Okay.
So you have to watch the language carefully.
Okay, but so you would say that's 3 then?
That's
Well,
3.
that seems like
They have already consented.
Then what is your opinion as far as the problem that's so prevalent in the churches today with addiction to pornography? If someone is married to someone who's addicted to pornography, would you say that's a biblical reason for divorce? Because has not been physical consummation, but it's clearly a case of, I think Matthew 5.
Sometimes I think it clearly is. I just would hesitate to give a general answer without knowing the details of a particular case. I wouldn't want to come down with something that said it is always number 3. Because the complexities of the person that is involved in this, you can have a person who is addicted to pornography partly because they're so fearful they wouldn't have sex with anyone. Does that make any sense to you? See, it becomes a substitute for genuine relationships to a woman, even at a sexual level.
Right.
So now in that case, what would I say? Should they get divorced? Well, it depends on what's going on in the marriage. Because sometimes the use of pornography for one partner can simply eliminate real sex. There, something needs to be done, maybe divorce, right? Because it's pathetic how sometimes women or men are made to suffer just because of that.
So I've always heard that your sexuality is a part of your identity. And so going along with what you said at some point, that identity is that our identity is that we are...
Yeah, there's a lot of confusion on that.
Yeah.
What does that do with sex change operations?
Yeah.
It would mean that if you It would mean you could not be the same person and have a sex change operation, wouldn't it? That's our atmosphere, our intellectual atmosphere is just full of confusions about this. It doesn't make sense. But I'm sorry, you go ahead.
Oh, that's okay. You just said at some point that our identity is that we're spiritual beings in a spiritual
That's
world.
right.
So then what is our sexuality?
Our sexuality is not spiritual. It isn't a spiritual reality. It's a glandular, physical, chemical, anatomical part of us. Right. Now, it needs to be subordinated to the spiritual. That's the safe place for it, but that's true of our whole body. Our gluttony is a physical reality. How heavy you are is not a part of your identity. Or how thin you are is not a part of your identity. See, these are physical traits. And they need to be in subjection to the spiritual. Okay.
Earlier, I think you said that our identities are kind of tied to our bodies and our appearance, and that kind of continues actually after.
Right.
Yeah, so I'm just wondering, because also I've heard, like Jenny, I've heard that our identity is tied to our gender, and that the way God created male and female, that maleness and femaleness reflect certain parts of him uniquely or something.
Well, I don't know about that. I don't think God is in that business. We have a tradition that refers to him as male. You can find reasons for that. And then usually our Reconstructionist friends want to come back and say, well, we also have reasons for treating her female. And that's true. But none of it is because of his genitalia, because he or she doesn't have any. And that's like what I said about brains. God doesn't have a brain. And you won't have one after you die, at least till the resurrection, and I doubt you'll have one then. I expect you'll get something better. The brain, after all, is just a very complicated piece of meat. Yes, last on this one, last one.
Sexuality in terms of a greater scope of just passion, strong feeling in general. The Gnostic worldview that really seemed to grab the monastics as saying the earthly realm is bad, spiritual is good. Anything that would strike strong feelings, therefore the created world is lesser, is bad, avoid it, has resulted in not having good teaching on
Very good.
experiencing passion but subordinating.
Very good. Very good. So now you find many people who want to jump all the way back, but that's because they lack good teaching. And sometimes it comes in the form, if you say that that is not essential, that sexuality is not a part of your identity, well then you are downplaying the physical. Well, the object is not to downplay it or upplay it, it's to get it right. And it's not easy. But it can be done, and we have lots of guidance for that if we look for it. We have to be thoughtful. We want to believe that the scriptural teachings in principle deal with these issues. But then we get all kinds of confusions, and these are foisted on youth, and then youth get twisted and hurt by it, and it doesn't go well. I want to suggest that for helping young people, there are a couple of books, I think you can still get them, by Charlie Shedd. Letters to Philip and Letters to Karen. And they are filled with immense good biblical and pastoral sense. Thank God for Charlie Shedd. So, Letters to Karen and Letters to Philip. And they're very helpful with many of these issues. I think we had better take a break or we won't be able to come back.